Chapter 10. Later that night. After dinner, Reyes crossed the courtyard in order to spend a little bit of time with Mangloss the magician. Generally speaking, he visited the mage twice a week, but so far he had struggled to cast even the simplest of spells. Mangloss opened the door to his small hut, and allowed Reyes to enter. "Good to see you, boy." "Master," Reyes replied courteously. He had a strange feeling about the mage that always seemed to put him slightly on edge, yet Reyes could never put his finger on what it was. "Take a seat," Mangloss said, waving at the contents of his hut. "Make yourself at home." Reyes looked around the hut, and as was normal, he could see nothing in the way of a chair. Instead, as he often did, he stepped over to the table and lifted himself on top of it. Mangloss didn't wait for Reyes to settle down. He walked over to the cupboard of 100 drawers, opened one of the many small containers, and found a tallow candle. He brought the candle over to the desk where Reyes sat. "Tinderbox again, Master?" Reyes asked. Mangloss nodded. "It's a very simple spell. Once you learn Tinderbox, I will consider moving you to some of the more complicated and more powerful spells." Mangloss held the candle while Reyes began to repeat the two-word chant that accompanied the spell. At the same time, he pulled his arm back in preparation for the necessary gesture that, according to Mangloss, would all help to focus the magic and steer it in the right direction. "Stop," Mangloss said. Reyes had barely started. "You need to concentrate on what you're doing. Don't just go through the motions. You have to really desire this candle be lit, as if it's the only thing in the world that has any meaning." "Master?" Reyes wasn't sure he could put that much desire into a small thing like lighting a candle. "Once you've cast a spell, any spell, magic will come to you much easier the next time. But at the moment you're still trying to break through the magical barrier. There's a reason not everyone in the world can cast a spell. Not everyone in the world has the patience." "I'm not sure I have the patience, Master," Reyes told him. "Maybe you don't," Mangloss replied. "But let's try it again anyway. Your father asked me to try and teach you magic. That is exactly what I intend to do." Reyes breathed in heavily and then looked at the small candle. He closed his eyes and again began to go through the motions, uttering the words and making the necessary gestures. "Feel it," Mangloss insisted. "I am feeling it," Reyes replied, but he wasn't certain what the mage had meant. And as he finished casting the spell just a second or two later, the result was pretty much as expected. The candle had not been lit. "Try again," Mangloss said. "This time try to add more feeling. Forget everything else that's happening in your life. It's unimportant. All of it. Concentrate only on the here and now." "Concentrate, Master? What does that mean?" Reyes asked. "Think hard about it," Mangloss explained. "I'll try, Master," Reyes replied. He concentrated on the candle. Again he pulled back his arm and started to utter the two-word chant. Something seemed to happen. He could feel a strange buzz set about his arm. It was accompanied by a faint blue glow. The blue glow vanished as Reyes turned to see what was happening. "Good," Mangloss said, sounding very happy about something. "Now, try to actually cast the spell. See if you can do it." Reyes breathed in heavily again. He drew his hand back once more, and again he uttered the two-word command. Once again his arm started to tingle, and a faint blue light seemed to gather about his limb. Reyes tried not to worry about it. He thrust his fist forward towards the candle, opening his fingers at the last moment. The faint blue glow arced effortlessly across the gap between Reyes' outstretched fingers and the candle, and suddenly a small flame appeared. Mangloss almost dropped the candle. "You did it! I can hardly believe it! You did it!" Reyes drew his hand back and looked hard at his fingers. There was no longer any sign of the faint blue glow he had seen. "I did it! Your father is going to be ecstatic when I tell him," Mangloss exclaimed. "Ecstatic?" Reyes said, puzzled. Mangloss blew out the candle. "Now, young man, light it again." Once his lesson with the venerable mage was over, Reyes made his way back to the castle residency. He was in quite an elated mood. He had finally managed to cast a spell. Mangloss had promised to teach him something else on the next visit, adding the further promise that the second spell should be a lot easier to learn. Sir Richmond was waiting by the main doors of the residency. It looked as if the old spy was just hanging out with the guards who were stationed there. But when Reyes appeared, he broke away from his conversation and approached the young boy. "Hello, Barden," Reyes greeted him. "Reyes," Sir Richmond replied, "your father is waiting for you in the study. It's time for your lesson." Reyes was happy, but was also feeling quite tired. Mangloss had spent most of the last hour getting him to relight the same candle again and again, and he was quite drained from the experience. He rubbed the tiredness out of his eyes and smiled at the knight. "Thank you. I shall go to him at once." It wasn't a long way to the Duke's study. Through the main doors, left at the bottom of the stairs, down the corridor for about half its length, and there was the door. As Reyes approached the study, he met his sister in the corridor heading in the opposite direction. By the look of it, she had just recently finished with her lessons. "Sister," Reyes greeted her. "Reyes," Jenni replied. There was something about her demeanour that suggested to Reyes that all was not well. "It's ogres again today." "Ogres?" Reyes repeated, nodding. "Okay, thanks, sis. Is there something wrong?" "No, not really," Jenni replied, though her features betrayed the truth. "You see, I don't need to refer to Father's books anymore. Father has said I already know everything he can teach me, and feels that I no longer need to attend his lessons. I know I should be happy, but it also feels like the end of an era. I'm going to miss these little chats we have together." "I'm sorry, sis," Reyes sympathised. He didn't really like the lessons, but it was a good way to spend some time alone with his father. The two parted, and Reyes continued on his way to the study. "Come in," shouted a voice after Reyes had knocked on the door. Reyes opened the door and entered. His father sat behind a large oak desk writing something. The Duke didn't look up, but he did gesture towards the guest chair with his pen. Reyes took the proffered seat and waited for his father to finish. "I thought we might discuss ogres tonight," the Duke told him, not looking up. "Ogres, father?" Reyes replied. "We did ogres 2 weeks ago." The Duke looked up and asked, "Really? Was it as recently as that?" "Yes, father," Reyes said. He glanced at the bookcase. "Are you sure you already know all there is to know about ogres?" the Duke asked. "I doubt it, father," Reyes admitted. "I expect there is a lot more to learn about ogres than you, or any of your books could ever know." The Duke smiled with pride. "That's a lot more insightful than any 2-year-old has a right to be." "Sorry, father," Reyes replied. "Don't apologise," the Duke said. "I'll tell you what. Why don't you choose a subject tonight?" Reyes climbed carefully off the chair and walked over to the bookcase. There were a lot of books here, and the words on some of the spines were too long or complicated for someone of Reyes' tender years to understand. Eventually his hand settled on one book in particular. Harps. I don't think we've ever talked about harps. The colour seemed to drain out of the Duke's face. His hand was shaking considerably. "Harpies," he swallowed. "Are you sure you want to talk about harpies?" "Are you all right, father?" Reyes asked. He hurried to his father's side, placing the book on the desk, and then standing next to the Duke, feeling helpless. "Should I call someone?" "I'm fine," the Duke replied, shaking his head. "I think you should put that book back, and we should discuss ogres." "If that is your desire, father," Reyes said worriedly. He picked the book up and headed back to the bookcase. "I guess you can teach me all about harps another day." "No," the Duke said. "Perhaps you're right. We haven't talked about harpies. Bring that book back and maybe we should see what we can discover together." Reyes returned to the Duke's guest chair with the book and made himself comfortable. He placed the book on the desk and turned it 90 degrees so that both he and the Duke could read it together. Reyes felt a little daunted at first. There were a lot of pages and the book seemed to be very wordy. Reyes was quite an advanced reader for a boy of his age, yet there were far too many difficult words for him to even be willing to attempt. "I suppose we should find a picture first," the Duke commented doubtfully. "Let you get an idea of what a harpy looks like." Reyes dutifully turned the pages looking for pictures. On the 9th page there was a biological breakdown of a harpy. A cross-sectioned pencil-thin outline of a talon and a wing sat side by side. Both pictures had lines pointing to different parts, labelling them with confusing scientific names. Reyes was unimpressed, so he continued to turn the pages until he got to page 19. On page 19 was a full-size colour picture. It was clearly an artist's interpretation of a harpy. She was facing out of the page, fully nude, but tastefully painted in the style of the time, so that a piece of gauze had floated across a certain part of her body at exactly the right moment. She had a coy smile on her lips, and a gleam in her eyes that Reyes noticed immediately. "She's beautiful." "You think so?" the Duke commented absently. "I guess it is a nice painting." "Look at her eyes. Those wings. They are amazing. And the way she's standing, it's almost as if she's beckoning to me." "It's just a painting, son," the Duke said, sounding concerned. "I know, Father," Reyes replied. "I almost wish I could meet one in real life. Are these creatures good or evil, Father?" "Usually they are evil," the Duke replied, choosing his words carefully. "However, I have good reason to believe that they can be taught decent human values." "I'd like to meet one of the good ones," Reyes commented, his eyes fixed on the painting. The Duke didn't comment. Instead he said, "Now that you have some idea of what a harpy looks like, we should return to the front of the book and begin to learn what we can about them." Reyes' reply sounded as if he hadn't heard his father. "Are there more pictures like this in here? Maybe I should go through the book first." "We should learn a little bit about them first," the Duke countered. "Then, if you really want to, you can look through the rest of the book quickly before you go to bed." "Okay, Father," Reyes readily agreed. He glanced again at the painted harpy and hesitated to change the page. "I think I'd like one for a pet." The Duke gave his son a worried look, and then turned the pages back to the very front of the book. Reyes and his father studied and talked about harpies for the next hour. Then, as the clock of the study announced it was 7, the Duke told Reyes it was bedtime. "Can I just look through the book first, Father?" Reyes asked. "Maybe tomorrow," the Duke replied. "It's already late." Reyes didn't argue. He got up from the guest chair and headed through the door to the study. "Hold on," the Duke said. "Put the book back where you found it first." "Yes, Father," Reyes replied. He did as he was bid, returning the book to the exact spot from which he had taken it, and then he returned to the study door. "Good night, Father." "Good night, son," the Duke replied. Reyes had some wonderful dreams that night. They started with him flying high in the sky. He was flying over the tops of trees towards a range of mountains where his mother, father and sister were all waiting for him. Then, as he landed, Jenni seemed to morph into the creature from the picture. For a moment he was scared, as everyone around him now seemed to be harpies, but his mind soon accepted this new truth. They were beautiful, and somehow he belonged with them. There was a strange noise. It was a gentle scratching that didn't belong in his dream. Reyes woke up suddenly and opened his eyes. He looked worriedly about him. It was very dark and he could see nothing, but the scratching continued. If anything, it seemed to be getting closer. Reyes took a moment to realise he was alone. Clarina must be in the other part of the nursery, watching over Minitilda and Kel as they slept. He wondered for a moment if any of them had made a strange noise. More than likely it was a mouse or a rat that ventured into the room and was on the hunt for a scrap to eat. Reyes rolled over, closed his eyes, and tried to get back to sleep. The scratching continued, and the sound began to really bother him. He began to think that he would have to find the source of the noise before he'd be able to drop off again. Feeling very tired, Reyes climbed slowly out of bed. It was very dark in the room, and Reyes was unable to see a thing. Fortunately, he had a rough idea where Clarina had left the candles by his bed. She hadn't left him any matches, but with his newly acquired tinderbox spell, he was able to get a little bit of light into his room. Suddenly, there came a muffled grunt from somewhere outside the window. The sound of hectic scrabbling and a chip or two of stone being dislodged from the brickwork and falling to the ground below. Reyes moved quickly to the window and glanced out. What he saw came as a bit of a shock. Someone had climbed halfway up the outside of the wall and had positioned themselves just below the other window of the nursery. That window was on the other side of the partition. Reyes screamed out in alarm. It was a strange sound, even for him. To some, it might sound like the noise a startled harpy would make. To Reyes, though, the sound seemed totally alien, and he clapped a hand to his mouth as if he couldn't believe that the noise had just come from him. The climber glanced in Reyes' direction. Then he climbed the last few inches of the wall and disappeared through the window and into the other part of the nursery. Reyes hurried. He ran to the door that joined their room to his. It was locked. It was always locked. Greyforth insisted that the door stay locked. Reyes didn't have time to wonder what his brother might have against him. Someone was breaking into the other part of the nursery, and somehow Reyes doubted that whoever it was would have the best interests of either Matilda or Kel in mind. He began to bang his fists on the locked door, hoping to wake Clelina and alert her to the threat. "Wake up! Wake up!" Maybe if he yelled loud enough he could alert the entire household. Nothing seemed to be happening. Reyes stood there helplessly for a moment. What could he do? He imagined the intruder doing all kinds of nasty things to his niece and nephew, and Reyes was stuck on this side of the door, unable to do anything about it. Reyes considered the door for a moment. It was made from good, solid wood, and was about 2 inches thick. Reyes was strong, though. He was very strong for a 2-year-old. Perhaps he could barge the door open. Reyes took a few steps back and charged full tilt against the door. There was a satisfying snap as part of the wood around the hinges of the door splintered. Reyes rubbed his slightly sore arm, took a few steps back to try again. This time the door flew off its hinges, and Reyes tumbled through the opening, landing square on top of it. It was dark in here. Very dark. Reyes could see nothing except for the moonlight coming in through the now open window and the candlelight seeping in through the doorway. He climbed quickly to his feet and grabbed the metal door handle and a few splinters of wood still attached to it. Then, using the tinderbox spell again, he tried to set light to the splinters. The splinters weren't a good subject for the spell. They burnt only for a couple of seconds before casting the room back into darkness. Nevertheless, it was long enough for Reyes to catch sight of the shadow of the intruder bending over Kel's crib. After the racket of the breaking door, Clelina began to stir. Reyes couldn't see her, but he could hear her as she started to scream. Then Matilda, evidently sensing that her nanny was in distress, also began to scream. Reyes could see nothing as the intruder quickly unsheathed a thin blade and slashed it at full arm's length towards the sound of the screaming nanny. Clelina suddenly fell very silent. Reyes heard rather than saw the intruder advance towards him, swishing his sword sharply. He panicked. He threw the door handle with its burnt splinters at the intruder, and then, rather than fleeing, he tried to grab another bigger piece of wood off the door for use as a weapon. Unable to find anything, he looked back towards where he'd last heard the intruder, certain that being unable to see his assailant, he wouldn't be able to defend himself from the coming blow. With Matilda screaming with the full power of her lungs, now joined by Kel, Reyes found it hard to concentrate on the intruder. He could hear nothing. He anticipated that any moment might be his last. Then the main door to the room suddenly burst open, flooding the nursery with light. Greyforth, Alicia, and 2 heavily armed guards rushed into the room. Greyforth took one look at Reyes and said, "What the hell are you doing in here?" Reyes looked at Greyforth in shock. He didn't reply. He was too upset to reply. Greyforth approached Reyes menacingly and raised his hand to hit the boy. "What have you done to my children, you little monster?" "Don't," Alicia said, and restrained his hand. "What?" Greyforth, taken by surprise, turned angrily to face his wife. Alicia pointed to the body lying next to Kel's cot. "Reyes isn't the cause." Greyforth turned his back on Reyes and slowly approached the body. He moved as if expecting the intruder to suddenly jump up and attack. "It's an elf," he said when he was finally close enough to be sure. Alicia had followed her husband across the nursery, using him as a shield while he bent over the prone form of the elf. For a second she seemed to be transfixed by something against the wall between Matilda and Kel's cribs. Then she spoke, and by the sound of her voice she was clearly upset. "Poor Clelina. We're going to need to find a new nanny." Then she took Kel from his crib and brought him across the room to where Matilda still lay crying. Still sounding quite emotional, she asked, "Why would an elf break in? Why here? Why the nursery?" "I'm not sure," Greyforth said. "He's definitely dead, though." He rolled the body of the elf over with his foot. A moment later he was unsheathing his dagger and plunging it into something that the elf had been carrying. "What is it?" Alicia asked worriedly. "Changeling," Greyforth replied. He cleaned the blade of the dagger on the elf's clothing. "It looks like they wanted to replace our son with their puppet. He would have become Duke eventually, and who knows what might have been led into the kingdom then." "From the look of it, little Reyes must have stopped him," Alicia remarked. "I think you owe him an apology." Greyforth said. He hesitated. And then he got up slowly and walked over to where Reyes was standing, still suffering from the shock of what had happened. Greyforth knelt down in front of him so that he could talk to him face to face. "I'm sorry, lad. I misjudged you. I want you to know I appreciate having you as my brother." Reyes didn't respond. He was still stunned by everything that had happened, and knowing how Greyforth had treated him in the past, Reyes couldn't even bring himself to look his brother in the eye. Greyforth put his arms gently around the boy and held him. He patted him on the back. "I know, with you watching out for them, my children will always be safe."